think she's a changeling.
In that case, be extra careful.
Go and find her. Where are you going, Master?
For a drink.
Thank you.
You want to play in this GP?
You don't want to play in this GP.
I don't want to play in this GP.
You want to drop and just play more Cube.
I want to drop and just play more Cube.
Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony Easy Peasy Mythic Maddox. You just went and got Mythic as soon as you wanted to, Anthony.
You know, it's not something that's been a goal. I honestly don't play that much Arena. It kind of waxes and wanes my enthusiasm. But I really got into Theros Beyond Death drafts. I think maybe I was just really nostalgic for the last set that I actually got to play in paper. And I just kept eating them like potato chips until all of a sudden I was in Diamond and thought, I wonder if I could just get Mythic real quick here. Turns out, just takes, 4-7x drafts in a row.
Well, then just let nobody ever say that you're not a competitively minded, highly skilled Magic player, Anthony, because it's easy for you whenever you want to do it.
I think it kind of comes out in the wash, though. I don't know if you remember that I was banned from playing Magic ever again when I lost to a Turn 1 Wayward Guide Beast in a Zendikar draft, so I think I'm just kind of back at neutral.
You take the good with the bad. Sometimes you get to Mythic pretty quickly. Sometimes you are banned from playing the game you love for the rest of time. It does happen that way. But Anthony, we're not going to talk about you. I know you love being the center of attention on the show. You're very braggadocious. I'm always trying to just rein you in. But we had a guest this week. We're not alone. Our guest requires no introduction. You know him from the Commander Versus YouTube series, the Think Twice podcast, and his brand new Cube podcast, the 540. It's Justin Parnell. Hi, Justin.
Hey, guys. Thank you so much for inviting me on to your podcast. It is nice to not do that introduction and just listen to someone else talk for a minute and a half.
We provide a service here. You know, you spend so much time in the driver's seat of all your various contents you produce, and here you're just along for the ride. You get to take it easy.
Love being along for the ride. In fact, if I could switch everything else to being along for the ride, I would do that.
Now that you've had a taste, we offer our introduction services for a nominal fee.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
You say that, but I might take you up on it.
Have someone else MC your podcast?
Yeah.
I could see it.
Yeah, you bear no responsibility if this show goes good or bad. If this episode goes bad, it's not on you, it's on us.
That's true. I know, it's the best spot to be in.
Because you are well proven. You're well established across the community as a very good... here's a question for you, Justin.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the word content creator?
Okay, so it's very interesting because I have been I'm going to put air quotes around this. I've been a content creator since prior to that term existing.
Okay.
So it is just, I mean, because I've been making Magic content for 11 years now, since 2010. So it's starting actually with my Cube article series on Star City Games.
That was the first content you ever produced, was your Cube article series?
That was the first consistent content. I had written articles like here and there for various websites, but that was the first. I have a weekly article slot. So prior to then, I had probably done 3 or 4 articles. I'd done 15 years ago, Star City Games had you actually could submit an article to them and they would pick the top 2 or 3 that were submitted a week and just publish those. It was which sounds unheard of now, but 15 years ago, that was a thing. And did some other small articles for Limited actually for other websites, but that was so starting in 2010, that was my first consistent every other week article release. Me and Usman Jamil, both of us we were kind of alternating on the Cube front for written content for Cube.
I'm not sure I realized that. That is before my time playing Cube, so I know that Usman is OG. He's been doing this in a long time. He's been in the game for a long time, and you have as well. I didn't realize that's where you started off, though. That's interesting. Yeah. But so how do you feel about the phrase content creator, that label?
It's mostly, what's the worst word I can say on this show? Just
you can say whatever you want.
Non-related. I think it's a shitty term because so often it's weird because in Magic, and I'm really talking about as Magic because that's where all my content is made. But content creator, what it really means is you're a streamer or you do something else. Because when I'm looking at it, it's like, from a wizard's perspective or a large audience perspective, like those are the two things. And then everyone else, it seems like it's like, oh, they're a content creator. And I always feel like it's like almost a derogatory term. I don't know.
Yeah,
I just don't like it.
It's so weird to me how in the last couple of years we've seen so many of these like industry like marketing terms that sort of become part of normal conversation, like viral marketing and influencer. And it just feels so disorienting to me. Like these aren't fun, cool terms.
No. It seems like
true.
it is
meant
to
cool.
put people in boxes. I do like the term I can't even say it. Content creator more than I like the term influencer. So I guess between the two, I'll take content creator.
The hierarchy of awful terms.
Yeah.
There is an interesting challenge though that, like you mentioned, you started a lot in writing and you do a lot of other types of media. So it doesn't make sense to really just call someone a writer today anymore, because so many people are doing, writing and also streaming and video production. Can we just call them makers?
I don't know.
I guess.
Makers
none of
of
the terms
stuff.
fit really well. I agree. I don't like the term, but it seems like a necessary evil to describe a lot of people because, we make this podcast, we write articles. I don't know. There's not really a bucket to put us in other than thought leader, magic thought leader, I guess, if you're being
That's even
optimistic.
worse.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really bad terms.
Yeah, I think we live with this until someone comes up with a better one, and I feel like we'll know it when we hear it, but we just haven't heard it yet.
Yeah, it'll be the word of the year in like 2033 will be whatever new word we have for these multimedia personalities that are producing stuff. It sounds so depressing to think of just what you're making is content, like you're just throwing more chaff into the machine and letting it spit out stuff for people. But
that's really true.
I don't have a better term.
That's what I feel like. I mean, honestly, I will say that over the last year, I am someone that I feel like I have imposter syndrome frequently, and as I've been making content over the last year, I've been able to come to terms with that more because I realized how much I need to consume content in today's world to like keep me sane, whether it be like movies, music, TV shows, any number of Magic content. Just because it's like so much. Like Anthony and I were talking before, and he's like, "How was your weekend?" And I was like, "Same as the last 52." So it's one of those things. It's like I know that people legitimately appreciate the content that I make, so it has made me feel better about making it. Because sometimes, like, there's times that I'm just like, "Gosh, do I want to stream this week? Do I want to record the podcast this week?" The answer is always yes. I'd say 95% of the time. Probably more than that, probably 99% of the time. But it's tough going in because it does feel like you're just churning stuff into this machine, right? Especially when I do 20 to 25 hours worth of content a week, and that's on top of my 50-hour normal job, real boy job. So,
hey Justin, that's too many hours a week. Just my advice to you. That adds up to too many hours a week doing this stuff.
I know. Tell me about it.
You're in it for the love of the game, clearly, though. You clearly love it, and it's
surely not the money. So it's definitely the love of the game. Unless Wizards wants to send me one of those fancy time spiral boxes, I'll take one of those. I don't have one yet.
I saw those. That look really nice. I don't know how you get on that list, but if you're not on it, then we're really far from being.
I'm not on it. I'm not on the list.
Someday. Well, we have Justin on the show to talk about your show, The 540, and I think, we asked our listeners what they wanted to hear from you if you were going to be a guest on the show, and most of the responses we got were some variation of just kind of your overall perspective on Cube. Where are you coming from? What's your perspective on the game and the format? And so we're going to talk about that, but first we do have a listener-submitted Pack One Pick One, as we do every week on Lucky Paper Radio. We are 1 week away from getting Time Spiral Remastered in our hands. I think next Friday is when my local game store is going to deliver my box I pre-ordered. And so I thought we would do this cube from listener Dan called Ancient Times. And this is a all old border cube. And Dan has made the decision to add some Time Spiral Remastered cards that are printed for the first time in the old border to this old border cube, which I think is, I don't know. I saw a post on the Reddit, and I think there is a divide in the old border cube community about whether or not to include the Time Spiral Remastered cards. Have you ever dabbled in old border as a limitation, Justin?
Not personally, but I have played multiple cubes that have. Now, they haven't had the opportunity to add powerful cards that were printed outside of that era, so I think that is an interesting angle to take.
I think this one is interesting. I think it also includes a couple cards that are not originally printed in Old Border, but they've made Old Border versions of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed a couple of those too going through this list.
I actually noticed them, we're going in real deep already, but I noticed them because a couple of these illustrations are amazing and I'd never seen before and was like, what is this Lightning Surge art? What is this Erratic Portal art? And they're not Magic artists, but I'm really excited to dig into this artist's portfolio. Simon Stoltenhag.
There you go. Art Corner here on Lucky Paper
Art
Radio.
Corner.
There's a nice little, we'll obviously link the cube in the show notes. There is a nice description of the design principles behind the cube, but the TLDR says no hand disruption, no land destruction, no tribal rails, no phasing, storm, or banding, thank God, no gold cards at all, no tutors, no searching your library for anything, and no life gain. So a lot of weird restrictions here, and it says just creatures, combos, and crazy board states. I will read the pack, and then we will take it to Justin and Anthony and hear what cards they are looking at. The pack is Carrion Feeder, Baron Moore, Dawn Strider, Hollow One, Uthden Troll, Viashino Heretic, Dromar's Cavern, Mog Infestation, Bog Wreckage, Juzum Jin, Tinderwall, Aromancer, Mercadian Bazaar, Young Pyromancer, and Mirror Entities. So I have to confess, I did generate a few random packs until I got a pack that had a couple of the new Time Spiral remastered cards in it. This pack we're seeing Hollow One, Young Pyromancer, and Mirror Entity, which are all in Old Border for the first time. Justin, I'll throw to you. What are the cards that are jumping out at you as a potential pack one pick ones from this pack?
All right, so first note is I always like to kind of, when I'm looking at a cube, things that I really appreciate, and I want to call out before I get started on this evaluation. No searching your library for anything. I'm all about that. If I can shuffle my deck one time and just get to it, like that's literally my favorite one. I would, you could sell me on your cube if you were like, it's all normal stuff, but you're never going to shuffle your library. Great.
We've done a couple cubes with that restriction before, and I really like that as a method of just keeping the games moving quickly. Yeah. And it's a fun novel limitation that doesn't nerf specific colors or specific strategies, just kind of across the board, just no searching your library for stuff.
Definitely. So when I look at this pack, I always kind of look at, in any cube, what card, if I'm taking in the pack one, pick one, is most likely to make my deck at the end of the draft. And I think
a good strategy.
Yeah, of course. Well, that sounds obvious, right? But in this cube, the reason that I brought that up in this extremely obvious statement is that oftentimes, I believe in most cubes that Young Pyromancer is in, it is generally a very powerful card, and one that, even if it is end up not being the most powerful card in your cube, it is often a kind of a linchpin card, because you're able to kind of focus on spells and spell slinging stuff afterwards. However, I've looked at this cube list, and I think that Young Pyromancer is mediocre at best, and that is because I don't feel like it is supported in the way that I would have expected in its own color. It seems like it is a better pairing as a blue card than a red card, which makes me very hesitant to draft it, because a lot of the red instance sorceries in this cube are either expensive burn spells, which Young Pyromancer doesn't like expensive spells, X spells, kind of the same thing, or sweepers that hit both sides of the board. So because of that, I'm kind of mentally eliminating Young Pyromancer as an option for me in this pack.
Very fair.
I think Jazam is a card that is probably pretty reasonable, because power to toughness ratio to casting cost is different in I guess this goes to Scourge. So pre-8th edition era, there is generally a higher casting cost ratio to a lower power than you've seen in future designs, which makes Jazam probably better in this cube than it would be in a lot of other cubes. But going on that fact, I think the very clear pick for me is Mirror Entity. I think this is going to be, if I pick this card, one, it's very easily splashable. It literally requires 1 white mana the entirety of the time that you're having this card. And two, because of the aforementioned thing of creatures generally have a lower power to their casting cost in older cubes compared to newer cubes, Mirror Entity is going to turn all of your small, ineffective creatures into monsters at any point in the game. And I think it is legitimately in this cube a card that is like taking over a game, even without having any of the tribal synergies, because it was mentioned in the manifesto of the cube that there's no tribal angles to this. So I'm really evaluating this cube as this is essentially overrun on a stick for however much mana you have every turn of the game. I think this is the card that's going to make my cube make my deck and be an impact card the most times out of the 15 cards in this pack, so I'm going to take Mirror Entity.
You see, Anthony? You see how Justin did that? Half the time I throw to you for a pack one, pick one, and you're like, I don't know, it's hard. Justin has a whole thesis laid out. There was an introduction, there was these body paragraphs, and then a nice conclusion. I think that's great logic there, Justin. Anthony, what are you looking at from this pack, given... how do you follow up Justin's great treatise here?
I don't know, it's hard.
It is hard, it turns out.
I'm going to be honest, I looked at this pack and I had almost exactly the same journey navigating through it, and I think landing on Mirror Entity makes perfect sense. The two little detours I took as well are, Hollow One is also a very powerful card. It obviously, like Juice MJ, it just has a lot of stats for the cost, assuming you can actually reduce it. So really the question for me is how much are you going to be able to do that? In this pack, we already have a land recycling, we have some spell shapers. So I think that it might end up being quite strong in this cube, but it's something that I think I would want to see proven to me before I really just jump into that pack one, pick one. I'm also a little bit interested in the Cavern. There's, maybe not a ton of fixing in this old border cube, and the layers are not the worst fixing you could actually get.
Yeah, just to read some of these cards, because people might not be familiar with all of them. So we mentioned Young Pyromancer. I think people know that one. Mirror Entity is 2 and a white for a 1/1 shapeshifter. It has changeling, so it has all creature types. But importantly, it has an activated ability. You can pay X, and until end of turn, all creatures you control have base power and toughness XX, and also gain all creature types. That last part probably being not as relevant, but as Justin said, kind of a repeatable overrun on a stick, which may be especially relevant in an environment where the bodies of the creatures are overcosted by modern R&D standards. Similarly, Anthony mentioned Hollow One. That's just 5 generic mana for a 4/4. It costs 2 less to cast for each card you've cycled or discarded this turn, and it has cycling 2. I think there's a very strong case to be made that no matter what you end up getting past, Hollow One is very reasonable in your deck and is like the safest pick, because the fact that it's a 5 mana 4/4, by modern standards, it's not that great, but as Justin pointed out, old creature standards, that's pretty good rate for any color for a colorless creature. And on top of that, it's got cycling. If you get mana screwed or something, you have to find that third land. It's a very, very flexible card, but nowhere near the ceiling of something like Mirror Entity or Young Pyromancer. And then Juzam Jin, this is a classic, one of the original overpowered creatures. This is just 2 black for a creature Jin. It's a 5/5, and at the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to you. So 4 mana 5/5 was OP for quite a while there in Magic's early days, and I like seeing it in this pack as a call out to that time. And I think it also is probably pretty reasonable in this environment. So I agree with all of your assessments. I gotta be honest, I'm just gonna take the Young Pyromancer because I think it's really cool to play Young Pyromancer in a old border cube like this. And while I agree the ceiling on that build around potential is a lot lower relative to the cubes we might often see Young Pyromancer in, modern or legacy or vintage cubes, where there are the full suite of modern frame cheap spells to enable it. I'm still curious to see what it can do, and it does have a very high ceiling. I do want to mention one other card, though, which is Tinderwall. This is it's a somewhat lesser known card, I think. This is green for an 0/3 wall, so 1 mana for an 0/3 wall, but you can sacrifice it to add 2 red mana to your mana pool, or you can pay a red and sacrifice it to deal 2 damage to target creature it blocks, or I guess it's blocking. That's not the Oracle text. This is a weird little card that people might not be as familiar with, but it's essentially a ritual in green, is I think the most useful way to think about it. So turn 1, you play your Tinderwall, you've got an 0/3. The next turn, you play a land, sacrifice your wall, and you've got 4 mana on turn 2. And in a slower environment like this, I think sometimes really big tempo swings, like getting to play a 4-drop 2 or 3 turns early, can oftentimes decide games. So I would not be surprised if at the end of the day, something like Tinderwall is the most unfair potential for any card in this pack. But I agree with everyone else's assessments, and I'm going to be starting on something more like a mirror entity. Or for me, it's Young Pyromancer, just because I'm really curious to see what that does in this environment.
I'm really glad you brought up Tinderwall, because I think that's the best card in this pack that I won't first pick, if that makes sense.
Fair enough. It's got a lot of potential, but also, one of the ways that the earlier designs of Magic are limited is that you don't, this might be best utilized. Tinderwall might be best utilized in a modern cube by, for example, spitting out like a Garruk on turn 2 or something. Some planeswalker that can generate value over time, such that the earlier you get it in play, the higher value it is. If you're sacrificing a card and using your whole first 2 turns to get a Juzum Jin in play, maybe that's good enough, but maybe your opponent just has a cheap removal spell or a bounce spell or something, and now you're down a whole card. And so definitely a high risk, high reward play.
Yep, definitely. I also want to note that I specifically agree with Anthony's assessment on Hollowed One. I like it. I want to see what it can do before. It's not a card I want to first pick, but it's a card that if I was able to get in some packs, because, this is with Cube, you can look at a list, but you don't always get a full sense of the cube until you're holding 15 in your hand or, looking at it on a screen. So I really want to pick Hollowed One. Like, it would be a high pick, but it's like a third, fourth pick rather than a first pick for me, because I want to see a few packs and see what I'm looking at as far as enablers for this to be like a powerhouse in my deck.
I agree. All right, so I'm on Pyromancer, Justin's on Mirror Entity, and where did you land, Anthony? What's your final pick going to be?
I'm landing on Mirror Entity pretty firmly as well. One other question about this pack, though. We sort of skipped past this Uthden Troll, which is just a 3-mana 2/2 with Regenerate 1. I haven't actually played with Regenerate that much. This is before my time in Magic. It seems pretty annoying for 1 mana, basically an indestructible wall.
Yeah, could be annoying. That's true. In my experience with Regeneration,
that's my summary of this card
with and against.
Is this card annoying enough to actually be good?
I think if it were not a red creature, yes.
Okay,
but as a red creature, I think this is the worst card in the pack by some degrees, and probably one of the less impactful cards in the cube. But something's got to be right.
It also stands out to me as one of the cards I'm least excited to pick for my deck. I also did not spend a lot of time playing back in Regeneration days. Took a big time off Magic when I was younger until picked up again as an adult. And my standard for like a card where Regeneration matters is I always think of Will-O-the-Wisp. Do you know Will-O-the-Wisp, Anthony?
It's been so long since I've read it, but
this is just a single black for a 0/1 wall that has flying and regenerate for a black. And I think that's like the top tier of like, here regenerate actually matters. My understanding of this card is that when it was in circulation and relevant, that it actually was a card that did stuff. It's a 1 mana wall that can chump block forever if you just leave a black mana up. And with flying too. So, the troll is significantly worse than that if we're trying to compare how relevant the regeneration text is. And comparing something like Uthden Troll to Mirror Entity, we can see Magic design has changed a lot over the years.
There's a little bit of a difference there.
Will-O-the-Wisp was a part of one of my first encounters with a proverbial table flip in Magic.
I'm glad it wasn't a literal table flip.
Well, we were playing on the floor, so it was more. It was more like I've been playing Magic since 1999. So
since you were living on the floor.
Yeah, since you were since the time my back was capable of sitting on the floor for hours on hours and playing Magic. It was more of a wide sweeping motion across the play area, where my friend could just not get past my Will-O-the-Wisp. Just infuriated. It ended the day. I went I was over at his house. I just went home because he was just incensed at Will-O-the-Wisp.
It's funny. I mean, I feel like these experiences echo through time. So I played as a kid, and then I dropped it for a long time. And when I picked it back up, Anthony and I were playing with our local friends, and I remember one of our friends built this deck that had not Wall of Frost. What's the other one? Fog Bank. That had Fog Bank in it.
Oh baby.
And this is a perfect example of a card that we were early enough in picking up Magic again that we hadn't really picked up on how valuable removal might be or evasion, and so just all of a sudden this Fog Bank was there, and I'm like,
wow,
literally, how do I beat this? It just blocks everything forever. It's impossible to beat this card. And it took me it changed the way I thought about the game, because I was like, oh, that's a thing you can do for just 2 mana. So now I have to reshaped my whole idea of how this game works, and not unlike Will-O-the-Wisp, I imagine.
Yeah. Fogbank in this
Am
cube,
I remembering
by
this
the
right,
way.
that happened, and then the next day you came back and you were like, guys, I was looking through Gather and I found Dream Fighter. How can you... If you thought Fogbank was good, how are you ever going to beat this card?
I do remember Dream Fighter. That was fun, too.
Like I said, Fogbank in this cube, so you may be able to relive that.
Relive the cruel punishment of Fogbank.
Yeah.
That is our Pack 1 Pick 1. So the Time Spiral Remastered cards definitely standing out of the pack, I would say, a little bit. But if I had no border cube, I would not be able to resist the temptation of playing with them. So I totally get it. This cube is great. Thank you for sending it in, Dan. Dan does a lot of writing about the cube when he makes updates to it, a very lengthy primer, and it seems like a little community of old border fans following him. So check out the cube link in the show notes. And if you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, send it to mail@luckypaper.co with your name and your pronouns, and we'll do it on the show. Maybe even Justin will be on again, and Justin will look at your Pack 1 Pick 1. It's impossible to know.
Who knows? Anything's
Maybe I'll be booted as the host because I can't tell a good story.
Anthony, I would never boot you as the host. It's a little fun to roast you sometimes. We floated some potential like questions or like topics and starting points to you before we sat down for our call. And I'm curious, just for you maybe to talk about your relationship to Cube. Just how did you get into Cube? It sounds like you've been doing it for a long time, been writing about it for 10 or 11 years. What's your relationship to the format?
So
Can I even add a little twist to that? So I'm curious just because when we came to Cube, it was very much like the Magic Online Cube, the vintage Cube was the defining example of what Cube is, and then it's sort of been a long journey sort of exploring what else the format can be. You've been playing a lot longer than we have. What did Cube even look like at the beginning?
Oh my gosh. So, all right. So I first played a Cube in 2008, and it was at a double PTQ weekend, I believe in Richmond, Virginia. And one of my friends told me, because like I said, I've been playing since '99. I took a short break for a little under 2 years because I despised Kamigawa Block, which I still do. But I was tricked because they released Mirrodin Block, which was very frustrating, and then Kamigawa Block, which I hated every facet of. So I was tricked into not being able to play with Ravnica Block when it was released, which I'm still a little salty over. But either way, I came back the next year in Time Spiral Block. But in 2008, I was at a double PTQ weekend, and one of my friends was like, "Hey, do you want to Cube?" And I was like, "What is that?" I'd never heard of it. And he was...
You just said, "Do I want to shape? Do I want to sphere?" I don't understand. Could you please explain the question?
I heard these other guys are rhombusing over there. Should we try that instead?
And he does it. I remember this very specifically because I've thought about this moment a lot. Because it's very weird to think of a time before... I was going to say this sounds like a crazy comparison, but in reality, Cube has been with me longer than any relationship I've ever had in my life. So it's like the moment when you're meeting the person that you're going to be with for the rest of your life. And my friend is like extending his hand out to me to like walk past him to this open seat at a table. And he's like, "Do you want to come?"
Clouds part and the harp
well,
echoes.
I didn't know
the room.
I didn't know at the time. I have no idea what it was. And he was like, "You want to come Cube?" And I was like, I kind of made a face, and I was like, "What? What are you? I don't know what you're talking about." This is between rounds, by the way. So he leads me over, and he's like, "I'll come tell you." He's like, "You'll like it. I'll come tell you." He's like, "It's draft. And I was like, "All right." I was like, "I'm in for that." So I sit down, and the owner of the Cube, who's just another like a local player in the Virginia, Maryland area. It was, by the way, I don't know, you're in Baltimore, right?
Yeah.
So my friend that ultimately helped me Cube for the first time was Kenny Mayer. I don't know if you were familiar with Kenny Mayer. Anyway,
I think so,
long
yeah.
time. And I sit down, and the owner of the Cube is setting out 15 card sleeved cards in the shape of packs. And he's saying it's just like, Cube is just, you take any cards that you want, and then you just shuffle them together, and then you just deal them out as packs. And that was the explanation it was given to me. And I don't know if either of you guys remember the time that you have opened your first Cube pack. But it was like, I open it, and honest to God, I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever done in my life, Magic-wise.
I remember that too. Specifically, I remember, I was the first member of my local playgroup here to cobble together something that could be described as a cube of just leftover stuff in my trade binder and things that were banned in other formats. And I certainly remember the first couple times we actually got 8 people together to draft because everyone is just hooting and howling about how good their deck is and how amazing all the cards in the pack are. And it's just, if you've only ever drafted retail limited, where you're oftentimes, you get a bomb, you're really lucky, but the packs are big power delta and most of them are common or uncommons that are just solid C's or whatever. When you open a pack that is full of what would be described as bombs in limited and the whole pack is full of them, it's a very striking experience.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I feel like that high is then so tempered by the low of realizing, oh wait, my deck is not broken and I'm just going to get steamrolled by Sulfuric Vortex. And that kind of just makes the experience even more powerful.
It was, and it was really, I mean, I remember there was like, I opened the pack and it had like Yawgmoth's Will, Mind Over Matter.
You remember the
Cloud
pack?
Ranger.
You remember
Not,
the pack?
I don't remember the whole
13
pack. I don't remember the
years
whole
ago.
pack. I don't remember the whole pack. I remember some of the cards
Pack
because
one,
this
pick
is
one. Justin's first pack of Cube ever from 2008. Let's
Yeah.
list them out.
I took. Those are the 3 cards I remember because those are the 3 cards I was deciding between. It was Mind Over Matter, Yawgmoth's Will, and Cloud Ranger. And the only reason I remember this is because, again, like, this was the start of a journey for me. I picked Yawgmoth's Will, by the way. I went 2-1 in the draft.
Hey, that's respectable for your first cube draft.
Spent the rest of the weekend cubing. At that time, I was a competitive player. I did not consider myself like any other, like there wasn't like I didn't play like specific formats. I was just like, whatever PTQs is available, I'm going to go to those. I'm going to go to states. I'm going to go to regionals. So I did that. There was a time I was pretty good at limited. I have a significant amount, like a double-digit number of limited PTQ top 8s when that was a thing that people said I cared about. So I'm pretty reasonable at limited, and that is kind of where my love of cube has gone. I lose the next round, so I'm X2, and I'm just like, fuck it. I'm going to cube for the rest of the weekend. So literally, we cubed for the rest of that day, and this was on Saturday, and then on Sunday, like, one of my friends was like, hey, I'm not going to play in the PTQ, I'm just going to cube instead. I foolishly made the decision to enroll in the PTQ and realized after, because it was a sealed PTQ, I realized I was like, my deck's not that good. So after I lost like the second round. So I won the first one, lost the second round, I just dropped and then just cubed for the rest of the day. And from then it was like I went home and I wanted to consume as much content as I could about it. And there wasn't a whole lot. Tom Lapile, who was a very early content creator, putting air quotes around that, had a lot of influence for me and I think a lot of people early in the format about cubing. And I read as much of his stuff as I could. There was very minimal. Evan Irwin, who actually owned cubedrafting.com at that time, who ended up becoming, we later were co-workers at Star City Games before he moved on to Cool Stuff, where he works now. He had some, like, maybe not some, just some sort of content, just something. So I literally consumed everything I could literally find, like, on the internet, like scraping, to try to find as much as I could.
Page 23 of the Google search results for Cube MTG, and you're clicking all the links.
Yeah. You could find some stuff in, like, some forums, some, like, old forums. I can't even think of, like, what it was. The things that you would find now, like, I know shortly after that, like, the MTG Salvation forums were a big hotbed of Cube. And
right.
At that time, they were not yet. Not quite. So from then, I get as much information as I can. And then I'm like, I go to at a Grand Prix or another PTQ or something like that, and I'm playing, and I need to build my own cube. So I start building my own cube, and finally finish it around the time that Conflux releases in like early 2009. And this cube, it was all cards that I owned, but I turned everything, like I stopped caring about, I stopped playing like Constructed because I just had a ton of cards. and I slowly like started to turn all of these cards into cards for my cube, or like upgrading cards in my cube. And I decided to make a 540 card powered cube. The only cards ultimately that I didn't own that were proxies was the Power 9. I didn't Time Twister wasn't in the cube, but the rest were, as well as Library of Alexandria, and everything else I owned. And at that time, cube was just the best cards you could come to for whatever size cube you have landed on. There weren't a whole lot of different cubes because there was just one. We weren't far enough along in Magic to where you could have enough good cards in white. Like, that was a very new thing. Like, Lorwyn was really like the first like resurgence of white for things that were like not embarrassing. Which sounds really weird now. Like, Mirror Entity was a huge deal. Cloudgoat Ranger was a huge deal. Like, for cubes then. And then like you get to Shards of Alar and like Elspeth Knight Errant. That was a quintessential, like that was considered like one of the like 5 best cards in like any cube that it was in for at least a couple of years. So it really was, it was just like, you are just, there was these, obviously there's subset of 50% of any cube is all of the best cards in each of these colors. Because there, like I said, the decisions were, how many lanes do you have? How many gold cards do you have? How big is your cube? Not, do I want to have a all old bordered cube, or do I want to have like a Grixis cube, or do I want to have a tribal cube, or do I want to have like a cube that doesn't have singleton? Like that, we weren't quite there yet. It was pretty close to getting there, but we weren't quite there yet.
It's really funny you mentioned that because, I feel like the history of Magic as a competitive game is semi-well chronicled, right? Like, you can see the evolution of how competitively minded players approached the game and changed their thought process and invented new thought technology to advance the theory of the game and improve on it. But something is never really talked about that I hadn't even really thought about until just now was the evolution of the game from a like less competitive, more like expressive position, right? Like, before Commander existed, before we had all this cube content, like you said, like, you were a limited player, you just played whatever was on at the GPs because that's just what you did. That's what Magic was. If you wanted to play at a high level, if you wanted to commit a lot of your time and your life to Magic, that's what you did. And now I feel like we have this whole ecosystem of ways you can play that are not associated with, I want to top 8 as many GPs as possible. And that's a really interesting evolution of the game that is kind of in parallel to the actual competitive evolution of the game.
Yeah, I mean, and at this point, the first time I heard about and played Commander, which was Elder Dragon Highlander then, before that was, Commander was the term, was also like in 2008. And I was introduced to that format. But like, I think like a year before, there wasn't, you couldn't be like a casual or competitive player, you're just a Magic player.
Right, exactly.
There weren't these divisions yet. And they kind of happened over like this 5-year span as Commander slowly grew in popularity, really, really starting with the 2011 like product that Wizards released, the pre-constructed decks. And then Cube slowly, like, and some people started making content. I made my Cube and then started making content in 2010. So I'm trying to think of earlier people. Usman made content. Anthony Avatolo, who's a good friend of mine now, he and Usman had the Third Power podcast.
Right.
Matt Kranstuber. There were a handful of people, and ultimately it's kind of crazy because all of these people, like, in this like a decade ago, like, we all became friends, like me and like a Cranny and Matt, Eric Klug, who everyone knows as the greatest altruist, Magic card altruist on the planet. I have cubed with him 100 times. And I'm not exaggerating.
Klug is a big Cube fan. I know.
Yes, you guys are from Baltimore, so yeah.
Yeah.
And he had, for a long time, he was known, well, in the Cube, I guess the Cube community, he had his common uncommon cube and also had his PT cube, like Pro Tour cube. So he's a huge cuber, and there's a bunch of other people, like I said, like Kenny Mayer, who's mostly retired from Magic now, but it was there was a small number of people just making content, and we were just really legitimately at that time, it was all just, we love this format so much and we just want to tell everyone else about it. My article series was called Cubers Anonymous, and the angle was like, I'm addicted to cubing. This is me talking about my addiction. And then it kind of just went from there. I remember like during the time that I was writing my articles, that was the first time that Wizards released a cube on Magic Online. Not the vintage cube, but just a cube, just in general. Then once it was released on Magic Online, then everything changed. Because then it was legitimately released to a wide audience. Because a million people play Magic Online. I don't know how many, a lot. And not all of those people consume content. So they're not looking for cube content. They're not looking for articles or podcasts or any of that shit. They just are like, what's this format that's on this program that I play? Let me check it out. And then from there, it no longer was a term that people would say, cube, what's that? And that's the difference. That's kind of that was when everything changed for the better.
Right. That's when people learned that, to a lot of people, what cube is the Magic Online Vintage Cube. And to your point, that's because that's their only exposure to Magic, is they open up Magic Online and there it is. So they're not reading other stuff and looking at other things. And so I think that a lot of the cube world is focused around that as a central cube, the most visible cube out there. And I think it's for that reason, like you said.
Yeah, every cube that's ever been on Magic Online has been played more than the most played cube not on Magic Online. Just think about that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I can't imagine there's any comparison. Like, what's next? Like, the person who's just like bring their cube to GPs and just trying to get random people to sign up.
It's hard to imagine. Yeah.
I literally I used to go to GPs and have a sign that would say cube. I'm not honestly, and I would literally just like sit it on the table and just have people come over and cube.
It's so interesting, like this part of your story, that's that shift of your friend says, hey, do you want to play cube? And you sort of like making a face and being like, well, what's that? To immediately being like, this is the format, this is what I want to play all the time, is so familiar. And it's funny how I think a lot of cube players are enthusiastic about it, and they'll tell other players, hey, come play cube, this is great. To the point where it's almost a meme, like, oh, cube players always be like, play cube, it's the best format. But so consistently, everyone who tries it gets immediately completely falls in the deep end.
Because it's great.
Yeah, it's like for years people were telling me to watch Star Trek, and I never did because I was like, I don't know, it seems like a nerdy thing. You know, why I'm not going to watch that. And then when I finally watched Next Generation, I'm like, wait a minute, this show's incredible. Turns out there was a reason all those people were telling me to watch it over the years. Yeah. It wasn't just a coincidence. It actually is a great thing, turns out. Where does that leave you now with relationship to Cube? I mean, obviously the Cube world has changed a lot. The landscape is way different now. There's way more content out there. Magic Online does it makes a much more conscious effort, I think, to highlight different kinds of cubes than they did, 4 or 5 years ago, which I think is great. Where are you now with Cube?
Well, it's really interesting because, okay, so we've just, I don't know when this is going to come out. Either the second or third episode of the 540 has been released, which is the Cube podcast that I'm doing through Star City Games with Ryan Overturf, my co-host. And that was pitched to me about 5 or 6 weeks ago, depending on when you listen to this in real time.
This will come out on Monday, by the way, so very soon.
All right, great. So so the 2 episodes. So about 5 weeks ago, this was pitched to me. From the time you heard the first episode, 3 weeks prior to that is when Cedric Phillips, who's the content coordinator for Star City Games, came to me and was like, hey, do you want to do a podcast? And I was like, no. And he was like, what if it's a Cube podcast? I was like, yes.
So Cedric knows how to get you to say yes to stuff, basically. Just associate Cube with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was the case because it's like I already, I said I make tons of content. And the thing that I love, the format that I love the most is Cube. I don't get a chance to talk about it. I'm like lapsed content creator in this format. I've done it for a long time. I'm sure I've spent a lot of hours doing it, but like in the last 5 years, I have not. And I told him, the first thing I said, I was like, Cedric, I'm gonna be honest with you. You literally are talking to me in the time of me playing Magic where I've spent the least amount of time, effort, energy, and ability to play Cube in any 12-month period ever. Which is right now. Since
that moment in 2008 when the clouds parted and you were introduced to the format.
Yes, legitimately. And because first of all, I don't play Magic Online. I dislike the program. It is Magic, but it's not what I love about Magic. And I play Arena because I like it better, but it's not the same.
Anthony and I are in the same boat, I think. I mean, Anthony plays a little more Arena than I do. Neither of us have ever booted up MTGO ever in our entire lives.
Yeah.
And it's just, I got into this game largely because I'm a person that gets very invested in my hobbies. And so if I were to be like a video game person, then I would just boot up World of Warcraft and you would never see me ever again. And I would have no more friends.
Yeah.
That would be the end of Andy as a social entity. I would no longer exist. So Magic was like this great way where like I got to meet more people in Baltimore. I got to get out of my house. I got to go see human beings, and I got to get off of a screen because I work on a computer all day. I got to get off of a screen for some time of the day, and so all those things I love about Magic that it makes it so meaningful to me is like totally gone in digital Magic, and so it's definitely been a struggle for us too since the quarantine began. I think it's a big part of the reason we started this podcast was like, well, here's another way we can do cube related stuff without having to stare at the computer more,
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
It really highlighted and sort of humbled me when Arena finally came to Mac. I was really excited for it. Arena looked great. And in the end, it was a great execution of Magic. I think it's a really well done program.
Yes.
But I don't find myself playing it nearly as much as I expected just because I realize how important that social aspect really, really is to me.
Yeah, there's not been a single time in my 22 years of playing Magic that I've realized how much the gathering portion was a part of the that I cared about, which was a significant portion now looking back.
It's about being around the table and your friends hooting and hollering about how good their pack is and how they don't even need a third pack. Their deck is already perfect.
I can't believe this wheel.
That's what I love. Exactly.
And to be fair,
this
that's
is still
the
in the
most
pack.
fun that I've had playing Arena, in this current time is just getting in the Discord and having, myself or somebody else just stream their games, just so you get a little bit of that experience back. You don't get to interact with your opponent, but at least you get to, rib your friends when they make a mistake or take a pick you don't agree with.
Yeah, because that's what it's about. That is like and kind of getting back to the original question, where am I with Cube right now? Like in like the 540, it is a Cube podcast, but this podcast is about our love of Cube from a wide angle, and it's going to be, hopefully we're going to talk like design and theory and drafting, but like I want it to be the feel of like how much we love Cube, and we're sharing that with everyone. That's really our goal for that podcast.
We share that mission here at Lucky Paper Radio and Lucky Paper overall. I mean, that's the whole reason we like. We make no money making this content. It just costs us money to pay for the hosting bills and stuff. But it's like the format has given us so much as Magic players that anything we can do to get more people excited about it and increase people's enthusiasm and enjoyment of the format, it's totally worth it.
Yeah, we just want to share that love. So. But, as it stands right now, and even today, like, I have not... The last time that I have personally cubed... I've cubed on Arena. It's fine. It's not the same. I did some cubes over, like, the last year on this drafting website, and then we played them out on Arena. Better, but it's not the same. The last time... And this is like a sobering reality. The last time I cubed... I can actually tell you it was a year ago last Sunday. It was the week before kind of everything changed in the United States with quarantining and COVID. And I was visiting my best friend, Ali Antrazi, where he lives in Charlotte. And on Sunday, we cubed on Sunday, and that was the last time. So it's been a year and a week since the last time I've done a cube draft in person, a real, honest-to-God cube draft.
Yeah.
And I have also not, for different reasons, I've not updated my personal cube since prior to the first SCG Con, which was in the fall of 2018. Because I've worked on... Now, I've built 3 different cubes since then. Well, almost like 3.5, really. Which are the 2 SCG Con cubes and the Players Cube that we did at 2019 SCG Con, which is the Qualifier Cube. And then last year, some of my friends at a game store that I used to go to, Cape Fear Games in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a wonderful store. You'll never be in the area because it's not an area you pass by. You have to go to it directly. Anyway, but they were like, hey, they have a copy of my 540 card cube, and they were like, can you update this so we can do a rotisserie draft with these parameters? Like, here's the cards that we have, here's what we're able to do. And I'm like, Sure. So I did like a quick like update for a rotisserie draft, which is, by the way, is my personal favorite way to cube. But that's a whole different story. So I did like a kind of a quick and dirty update with the parameters they were requesting so they could do a rotisserie draft with it. But that was a literal, like, I did this in an hour, which is not the appropriate amount of time that I need to update a cube that has not been updated since 2018. So
Right. Well, here's the beautiful thing about Cube, right? Like, you haven't played much in the past year, as I think very few people have. I mean, our local playgroup moved our cubing online begrudgingly because it is nowhere near as much fun as it is playing in person. But still getting a chance to play every week has been important for us, I think, over quarantine, just to keep magic happening in some way, even if it's nowhere near as fun as it used to be in person. But if you had taken a year off of competitive Magic and you were writing articles about playing Standard or something, getting back into it would be a big hurdle because you would be way behind the meta and all the conversations that had happened and stuff. But that's not how Cube is. Cube is evergreen. You can not play for a year, pick it up, start doing a podcast, and it doesn't reflect on any of your opinions or theory or perspective because it's a big tent. Cube is just always here. It is evergreen, which I think is one of the beautiful things about the format.
absolutely. Yeah, you could take it. I mean, one of the things that I've loved about Cube is I've been able to have my Cube and had someone like came to an event one time and they're like, I haven't played Magic in 4 years. And I'm like, great, perfect. So we're going to Cube and you're going to love it. And of course they did.
Of course, obviously.
Yeah, because you're right back in. It is like it's eternal. It doesn't matter. Like looking at this cube, the Ancient Times cube, and prior to probably a few weeks ago, these Time Spiral remastered cards were into the cube, and this is a cube that could have been not updated since like 2003, and it's still a cube, and it still would be awesome to draft. So
totally, yeah. I mean, I think you sort of mentioned like you felt like your cube really needed to be updated at certain points. On the other hand, we can sort of be a little bit more forgiving and say, well, the fact that they've printed new cards, sure, we want to experiment with them, we want to explore this new space, but just because there are new cards doesn't make the existing cube any worse, and it's just as much fun today as it was a year ago or when you designed it originally.
Yeah, of course. And it's just the need, as a cube owner, it's the need to update it. Because it's not
totally. I mean, and that's why, Cube is not just one game. There's the game of playing it, and there's the game of, fiddling with the list endlessly, which is a separate activity.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, taking Ancient Times as an example, this is a cube that, like you said, prior to Time Spiral Remastered, had seen no new cards in the designer's self-restricted card pool in, 12, 15 years or whatever. And yet, I'm looking at the blog here, and cube has been updated almost every week, for, a couple times a month. And that is the beauty of this, right? Like, even if you never get any new injection of cards, you never care about a set review for some new set because you're not touching the new cards, there is so much space to be explored, even in just, this old border restriction, to kind of tweak things and fine-tune the environment to make it do what you want it to do.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself.
Along those lines, I'm definitely interested on if you sort of have a different approach to playing Cube as a player and designing cubes as a designer. Do you sort of think that there are different perspectives that you want to take and ways that you approach it?
Yeah, I have I guess a somewhat of a hot take on that. I think that not enough designers of Cube play Magic widely enough to be able to inform their opinion entirely as a designer.
Say more about that.
Yeah. So it's very, very easy to focus on designing cubes, and it takes more effort to iterate on that through playing. And oftentimes, and this is, again, coming from my experience as someone who's played this game for 22 years, that I learn a lot about cards and thinking and stuff about, proactively improving my cube from non-cube design sources. So oftentimes, when you're designing a cube, you are trying to create a specific environment in mind, and you're trying to create specific archetypes, and you have these goals that you're trying to follow. And only really truly through playing or seeking feedback of other people that you respect that have also played the cube can you adequately make changes that are progressing those ideals. And that sounds obvious. Well, of course you need to play your cube to be able to improve your design of it. But I guess what I mean is, like, I think that there are cards, when you're looking at it from a design perspective, that don't make your cube because they don't appear powerful enough. That I think if you are looking at Magic through a wide lens and saying, this is how Magic decks are constructed, that's going to inform your opinion on what cards could be in your cube for those archetypes. An example that we actually slightly talked about on the 540 last week was Condemn, and Ryan was like, Condemn's not a good card. And I was like, well, it's not a powerful card. And I think oftentimes, cards that aren't powerful, that are like super duper role players, don't make it into cubes very often enough. And this is something that I struggle with like everyone else does. But if you have someone that is drafting a white-based control deck, often at the end of the draft, as they're constructing their deck, you could ask them, what card would you like to have added to this deck? And they'll say, like, well, it would be nice if I could have like a Condemn or an Oust or something like that. Those cards aren't powerful. And because of their inherent power level, they don't make cubes often enough. But as someone like that plays other formats knows, like, those small role player cards that are going to go the last 3 picks 100% of the draft, and those are the cards that you're looking at and you're like, well, those are the cards that I'm considering cutting. Those are the cards, if you identify the correct ones, that are going to make the biggest difference in having fully fleshed out archetypes. Because not every card is a first pick or a second pick or even a 10th pick. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're doing a traditional draft and you have 15 cards in your pack, there's going to be a last pick every time. There's going to be a last 5 picks every time. And, looking back at this, I'll continue to talk about the cube. We've been talking about the Ancient Times cube. The Uthden Troll, there's a good chance that I'm just wrong and I dunked on that card earlier. And that is probably the exact type of card that I'm talking about here, that I was like, I look at this card and I'm like, this card's not powerful enough for this cube. But I also have not drafted this cube. And I'm willing to bet, because you said this cube's been updated every week or two, indefinitely, that the designer of this cube has said this is a role player card that actually fits these decks when they're constructed. And I think a lot of cube owners don't. I think they get caught up in like the flashiness, and sometimes the small things like Uthden Troll or Oust or Condemn, because of their power level, slip through the cracks. And I don't think they make enough cube lists. And it's easy because it doesn't make the cube suffer is the problem. It's not making the cube worse by those cards not being in it. But if you had those cards and you identified those cards, I think you make your cube better when you can figure out what are the holes that I'm missing across all of these archetypes and across these cubes that are going to fit into what a real deck in this cube actually looks like.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you've made 10 or 12 really solid points here. One of the one that really stands out to me is just the importance of playtesting, which you say is kind of obvious, but I honestly don't think it's ever obvious enough. Like, as a maker of anything, you can't just expect your first iteration ever to work. Playtesting is really important, and being willing to evolve and iterate the cube is always going to be really critical, just as much as if you're cooking a recipe or writing a book or building a commander deck. You're going to want to iterate and tune it and actually get real data on the way things work. The other point you made about sort of these seemingly less splashy or powerful or like the not headliner cards, I think is also really important. And Andy's touched on that a lot in the past, I think, from the framework of saying, well, he's trying to design a cube not that is a collection of good cards that all work in, are powerful in isolation, but making an environment where good decks can be drafted. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. You want these sort of fundamental bread and butter cards that really sort of tie together archetypes, even if there isn't a version of them that is as splashy and powerful as some of the really peak power level cards in the environment.
Definitely.
Yeah, we're big champions here of not just trying to define cube as, these cubes that are power optimized within some set of restrictions, whether that's powered cube or even a no border cube, right? Like, cube is not just playing the best cards within a certain set of restrictions. But I do think that we've talked about before how one of the reasons why that is such a common pattern that cube designers follow is that if you are just playing the quote-unquote best cubes based on your own evaluation of what you think the best cards are within your restrictions, that absolves you of a lot of the balancing that you're describing, Justin, where you're like, well, yes, I'm going to look at Oust, a card that I love and think is really powerful, actually. And I'm going to compare that to Hero of Bladehold. And I'm going to say, well, Hero of Bladehold is better than Oust, is my subjective evaluation of this card power level. And therefore, I'm not going to include Oust. But what you're saying is actually much different, which is that maybe you don't need another, 4-drop that, aggro decks will play begrudgingly because they don't want to play that many 4s, and mid-range decks don't necessarily need. And maybe what you actually need is more cheap interaction. And for a lot of reasons, I think designing cubes that are not at the limits of power level within their own restrictions is way harder because you are faced with way more of these questions, right? Like, my main cube is a, vintage, unpowered, as powerful as I think it can be within reason cube. And there's only so many. I play basically any cantrip I can get my hands on that I think is remotely playable in my environment.
Cantrip.
I love Serum Visions. I love Portent. I love Sleight of Hand. Like, give me all of these cards. I think they're fabulous for the exact reason you're describing. But how many would I actually run if there were 20 more, right? I don't know where that limit is because at some point I run out of 1-mana cantrips that are playable. And I am just, I'm down on other cards. So that's one of the things I think is most interesting is that Cube, I think, is most fascinating because if you look at Modern or you look at even EDH, a much broader casual format, there is very little truly completely unexplored space in terms of like viable EDH decks that can sit down next to other EDH decks that are played in the broad EDH meta. Every color combination has been picked to pieces and every viable commander has been built in a lot of different ways. And sure, there's novel decks that can still be made for sure. But Cube, to me, feels like we just have the tip of the iceberg that we've actually explored, right? We've really kind of gone over this territory of power optimized cubes within some set of restrictions. And we've, as a community, really just rubbed that rock until it's smooth. But there's this whole underwater level, like, mass of cubes that are at some different power level that I think are really unexplored because it's so much harder. It's so much harder to say, this is the density of cheap removal I think this is appropriate for this environment for a variety of reasons. And this is the density of threats that can snowball I think is appropriate, as opposed to just playing all the ones that are good enough to make the cut.
Yeah.
Right. And the other, really important aspect of what you just said, Andy, is that you're talking about, well, we have all this design space for EH decks, but even within a pretty casual environment, things still need to sort of cross a certain threshold before they're viable and really make sense to explore as a deck. With Cube, because it is a sort of insular mechanic or insular design where you're not worried about the power level balanced against all Magic cards, you're only worried about the power level within that individual cube. There's even so much more space than just saying, well, yeah, now we can play with any cards, but also we can really, really dig deep into any sort of subset of cards that wouldn't be viable, even in another restrictive format.
Yeah, we've talked about friend of the show, Minor Bug's Misery Cube before, which, for your benefit, Justin, this is a cube that is designed to be miserable and features a lot of extremely low power level cards. The way to describe the environment in a nutshell is that Rishadan Pawn Shop is highly playable. It's a pretty appealing card in that environment because you're most often losing to decking, and being able to not deck is a good value to have.
I mean, that's guaranteed.
Yeah, so like that's an environment that none of those decks could be played alongside any other deck from any other cube I've ever seen, right? That is an environment that is entirely on its own island of unique experience. And I think there's so many more environments like that are to be explored. Because like you said, Anthony, they're entirely insular. They're self-contained. So there is no broader power level, as wide as it might be, because there is a wide power level band in EDH. There is no broad power level you're trying to appeal to slot into.
I've said I'd play any cube once, and the Misery Cube is the one that actually has made me pause. I should really try it one day.
I have played the Misery Cube, and I think it's actually very interesting. It's weird. The cube it is most similar to, I think, is actually the Degenerate Micro Cube. This is a cube of mine, Justin, that is designed to be as powerful as possible, just ridiculously powerful. Your deck size is only 15 cards, so you get to do broken 2-card combos that you shouldn't ever get to do in Singleton Draft. And it's weird how similar they are, because in both those environments, first of all, decking is a major concern that has to be addressed in some way, which is a similarity. But also, what you're doing is you are operating on a totally different axis, where like typical Magic heuristics like tempo and card advantage don't really matter. What matters is the specific cards that are combined in your deck and how they line up against your opponent's specific cards and whatever their strategy is. So I recommend the Misery Cube. I think you should draft it if you get a chance, because I thought it was a very interesting experience.
It seems like they both of those two cubes revolve around very small, important edges in understanding card interactions, whereas one of them tries to sort of condense that and make it as quick as possible, and the other one tries to draw it out and make those decisions as important as far down the game as possible.
Yeah, all the games I've played of the Misery Cube never actually ended. We just talked about it and agreed that this is how it would end, and then somebody conceded.
That does not seem like in the spirit of the cube.
It's kind of fun. You get to, work together to figure out, like, all right, well, if you can Rashad and Pawn Shop this every single turn, then yeah, eventually in 100 turns, you'll eventually get me, so I'll just scoop now.
Speaking of the diversity of cube, I know, Justin, you've designed a bunch of different cubes for different contexts. And I'm curious, both, what are the through lines in the way that you approach designing cubes in those different contexts? And what are the differences that change the way you approach it based on some sort of baseline, if you have one?
Yeah. So I've designed two cubes for the purpose of ultimately the top 8 draft at SCGCon, which was something that entire event was something that I really pushed for and had been trying to get some sort of high level cube thing happening at our events, because for those of you that don't know, I'm the purchasing manager at Star City Games. Is my 9 to 5 job. Along with that, I've been a part of the events side for many years, so I've been trying to say, we have the ability, we can do this, then we have SCGCon, and I'm like, this is the perfect place to do this. So ultimately, it was then they were like, okay, cool, well, you just do everything, and I was like, all right. So then goal was, okay, I have to design this cube both years for the purpose of this top 8 draft. And it's unlike anything else I've ever done. It's not as difficult as the Player's Cube, which was in the 2009 SCGCon, which I'll talk about in a second. That was actually the most difficult thing I've ever done, cube-related ever. But the 2 cubes for SCGCon, it was weird because you know how we were talking about your cube is never finished, you're just constantly updating it? Not the case
but
here.
you had to finish it.
You had to finish it.
That's mortifying.
It was. It is mortifying. You're totally right. Because I'm a cuber. There is no finish. When I turn it in, there has to be a day, and this was self-mandated. I had to just say, this is a day when this is done. And I know, when I turn it in, I'm like, as I'm sending this file over, I'm like, should I take out this card for this card? And this is something after that date, after I turn it in, I should make these changes, and it's too late. We've publicly said it, I can't change anything from here. And that was...
Yeah, that's a scary thought. I don't like that idea.
Yeah, exactly. As a cube designer, that's a horrifying thing. And, so a story I'll add, for the 2019 version, for people that are listening to this podcast and have listened to my primary podcast, Think Twice, my co-host and I, Ali Antrazi, talked about... From the very first time we played with Oko Thief of Crowns at the MTG Arena Early Access event, literally one game each, where this card is highly problematic. It's one of the most powerful cards we've played with. I had it in the cube, in the 2019 SCGCon cube, and I sent it. I sent it in the final version with Oko in the cube, and I knew the entire time it was way too powerful.
And this is in a powered cube, right? This is the powered top.
This isn't a powered cube, not a vintage cube, but a powered cube, which I'll probably talk about a little bit. But I knew that I was like, it's too good. I know that it's too good. Even some of the people that helped me test, because I actually, when I was designing and tweaking these cubes, I actually only one time of all of the time of the testing session for both cubes that I actually drafted, and that was only because someone couldn't make it. I had a roster of 10 people.
I'm jealous of your playtesting process, by the way. We've done a lot of drafts of my own cube, and I've spent a lot of time tweaking it and trying to balance things, but I can't imagine if I put this in front of a competitive group of people, how quickly they would break it and just say, well, the only archetype worth drafting is this.
Yeah. And ultimately, and I was fortunate that I actually, I grabbed people from kind of all walks of Magic. I which sounds horrible, but I segmented people into like what I thought I was going to be getting from them based on the draft. Like I was like, these are like competent casual people. These are competitive players. These are people that are limited experts. And then these are people that are cube designers. Like I always had other people that were, but both years I had 2 people that were other cube designers that had their own cube. And ultimately I think I had, one year I had 9 and the other year I had 10 people. So I had like people to swap in case someone couldn't make it that week or whatever. And then one week I actually ended up playing. Anyway, so I send this cube off with Oko in it, and I'm just like, I was like, this is a mistake. I was like, I should have just taken it out. But it's a brand new card because Throne of Eldraine had not come out super long ago, at the beginning of October. And SCG Gon's taking place the first or second weekend in November. So it hadn't been out that long, but it was long enough to where I knew. And ultimately, Jonathan Brostoff, who is one of the best cube drafters in the world, who he and I have now become friends after this, actually meeting at this event, and now we've become friends afterwards. He also recognized that, picked Oko really highly, and Oko was one of the cards that carried him to the win. But it's like, it's scary.
You heard it here first. J-Bro carried. Not actually that good, just knew to pick Oko.
Yeah, it was just Oko. He would actually, honestly, he is humbler than he should be. He would actually say that. He would say the 2 cards that won me this were Wrath of God and Oko. I didn't do anything. I was just holding the cards.
Hey, it's J-Bro, and I just wanted to give a huge shout out to my man Oko. I appreciate you, and I'm looking forward to doing it again at CubeCon.
But it's horrifying knowing that you're like, this is the finished product. And I had to say to myself, like, this is it. This is the cube that I want to send. And in the moment that day, it had to be, because there has to be a time where that's the case.
Right.
But I hated it because from then into SCGCon, I'm like questioning myself. I'm like, should I have changed this? Should I have powered up this archetype? Should I have like slowed this one down? Should I have like slightly adjusted like the CMC of, across red? Or there's 100 different things that you think about. And I was fortunate enough, because of this testing process, where I had all of this data and all of this feedback from all of my testers. So I had a lot of agency in being able to change things for the better. But it was also really weird because the intent was to draft this one time. Not a single time after that event have I considered how I would change this cube beyond that. And that's a question I get very often. Hey, I copied the SCGCon cube. How would you change this afterwards? And my answer has always been, I've never thought about it.
Cross this question off the list.
Yeah. I assume the answer is cut Oko and then nothing else. No
cut
other
Oko
changes.
for sure. That one I can answer easily. Cut Oko immediately. I legitimately have never thought about it because the goal was to create a dynamic play environment that's going to be good for coverage, that's going to be engaging for the players, and all of the players, all 16 people that played, literally, I think I literally heard from 15 of them verbatim, this is the coolest event I've ever played in my entire life. And that ultimately is the best feedback I ever could have gotten.
That's great. And I am glad that you're out there in a position to actually make it happen, trying to make competitive cube drafts a thing. Whatever the next SCG Cube event is, we will be there. At least I'll be there. I'll probably drag Anthony with me too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's such a perfect and valuable sort of execution of your goals. And we just said, for most people, designing a cube is a living, evolving draft experience that you want to keep changing and adding to. But just being clear about what your goals are in this context and saying, this is for a single event. We want to encourage certain types of gameplay that work in this certain way, and not sort of being overwrought about it and thinking, well, I have to change it after. The goal is complete, and that's fine.
Yeah, I never thought about it. And, ultimately, like, it was just, when this idea was pitched, it was decided on by people beyond myself. Like, I was involved in this, but to say, like, we want to have this a powered cube. So I had the option, I had a full agency over what this cube was, but that was one of the things, was a powered cube. And I was like, okay, well, I knew when I pitched this, I was like, I don't want this to be a vintage cube. And there's a big difference in powered cube versus vintage cube, because in a vintage cube, you are trying to do the most powerful things you can do in Magic. I think commonly, obviously these are just kind of ambiguous terms, but when people think of vintage cubes, that's what they think of. And I didn't want to make this a cube where you're trying to do the absolute most powerful things, because there's a lot of fail rate in archetypes and vintage cubes, and I really didn't want to have archetypes where there was a high fail rate, because this needs to be an engaging event for people to play in and watch one time, because you don't get another shot at this. We don't get another shot at running this event, at broadcasting it. The players don't get another shot at playing it. So there needs to be this is a cube that's going to have power in it, but it needs to have a high amount of interaction. And that was something.
You can't just say, well, a player is going to be excited to force Storm 4 times because it's going to work one time, and that's going to be great. It needs to work the first time.
Yeah, there's already enough fail rate in Magic because we have a land system in our game, which I love personally, but...
Well, not anymore. You see the cards from Zendikar Rising? Lands are over now. We just have both on the same card. It's great.
Yeah. So there's already enough fail rate in Magic, so I tried to remove that as much as possible and had a powered cube. So I had the Power 9 and minus Time Twister and other cards in it, but I really worked hard to try to make this as interactive as I possibly could, because I want the games to be engaging. And really, to me, this is another opportunity, a lot like the MTGO Cube, that I'm like, this is going to be a lot of people's first time they're going to see Cube. They might watch our broadcast because they like Standard or Modern, and that's what they historically watch. And this might be the first time they've seen Cube. Maybe they've heard of it before. But I want them to watch this and be like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. I want to do it. And I feel like if you have a niche cube or even a vintage cube that is like kind of idealistically farther reach of someone that is just looking at this format for the first time, I don't think that's the best way to get them hooked. And that's always been my goal with all of my content for Cube. I want to get someone else addicted to Cube because it's the greatest format in the world, and I want people to love it as much as I do. And I just felt like that was the best way to accomplish that goal.
The other thing that you haven't mentioned, but is similar, is that, the MTGO Vintage Cube, which again, I think for a lot of people is the de facto Vintage Cube, is very unique in that it is always played in a, what's it called when they don't do like fixed pods? It's like you just...
A league draft?
League, yeah. It's always league drafted, which I think makes a huge difference. You're talking about this top 8 for this event, which is a event for stakes. There's something on the line. You want to make sure that it's as competitive and broadcastable and entertaining to watch as possible. Not everyone can be in a broken blue deck in that pot of 8. Somebody's going to be the green black drafter, the green white drafter. Two color pairs that in the MTGO Vintage Cube tend to struggle. It's kind of like hope you get a Black Lotus and play a turn 1 Planeswalker. Otherwise it's hard to hang with the unfair decks. And so, yeah, I think everything you described for how you changed your expectations and what you wanted the cube to be makes a lot of sense for that context. And in some ways, I almost feel like having that specific context was very freeing, because people all the time post their cubes on the subreddit or in Discords and stuff asking for feedback. And one of the always questions I ask is like, the feedback depends on your context. How do you expect to play this cube? And for a lot of people, it's like, well, I want to play it all the way you can play cubes. I want to do full pods with my friends. I want to take it to my LGS. I want to grid draft one-on-one with my roommate or whatever. It's like they want it to be everything, right? Because that's their one cube. They want it to fill all of the roles that a cube can fill, which can also work, but it does introduce more complexity than just saying, no, here's what it's for. It's for competitively minded players that are at the top 8 of this event to draft once to determine a winner, and that's going to shape all of my decisions.
Yeah, I mean, would you agree that just I think having such clear goals is awesome, and I think one of the reasons it is you can just back up all of your decisions, and when somebody says, well, why is this card in here, or why is this card missing, I expected to see this, you can say, well, this was my goal, it doesn't contribute to that.
And that was a lot of...
And also shove it.
Yeah, that was... Yeah, I got to say, well, this is what it is. I'm not looking for feedback here because it's done. There's not going to be any further changes.
Even better. You get to say, I'm not looking for feedback.
You can take your feedback and you can copy this cube and you can institute all of your feedback, and I'm happy to have you do that. But my portion of this cube is done. So it was freeing because it was that fight against like having a due date for your cube and saying, this is it. This is the last version of this cube you're ever going to see. That's horrifying. But saying like, these are things I don't have to worry about. That part was nice. I mean, ultimately, I loved that. I loved the entire thing. Even the having the due date and having that time between when I submitted the cube to be finished to when the players drafted the cube and we covered it. That was scary time because I'm just like, this is like my baby I'm throwing out in the world, and I want it to be good enough. I spent a lot of time on this, but it was that was the end. And then after that, I didn't have to worry about it. And I honestly, like I said, I've literally, for either of those cubes, I've not thought about any changes I would make because that wasn't the goal. That wasn't the goal of that cube, is to live beyond that. And if people want to do that, wonderful. And I'm glad they do, but I spent all of my energy already. It was on the front end. The Player's Cube was the most difficult thing I've ever done cube-related in my entire life. And I probably won't do it again. I might do it in a different way.
Yeah, this was a cube that people could basically vote on some portion of the cube, and you kind of orchestrated this entire democratized system where you had pools of cards people could vote from, and basically polled people to fill out. I think it was like 110 slots in the cube that were up for vote, right?
Correct. That's exactly right.
So that was an interesting experiment that in cube democracy, which I've seen other people try and do something like that, where like, let's have this whole community build a cube one card at a time, and it's a very interesting experiment that I think reflects a lot more about what the community's values are than it does makes a good and interesting cube.
Yeah, which was the hard part, because I disagreed with them frequently. I would say 2/3 of the time. Ultimately, the concept of people voting and calling it the Player's Cube and that whole marketing angle was... I worked on this with the marketing assistant manager at Star City Games, Jenna Juliffs, who no one has any idea, but I'll give her a shout out. She'll never in a million years listen to this podcast. But
damn,
that
one
was
less listener.
Yeah, but that was, she worked with me a lot on this idea. And ultimately, they were like, well, let's have them vote on everything. And I was like, there's no way I trust the internet even remotely near that level to put together a competent cube. There's no shot. So how many cards can I let them vote on and still design the cube? Now, I knew that whatever number I landed on, I was going to be making what I called buckets of 3 cards. A lot of times they were very similar in what they did in function, but still, over the context of 110 cards, can look very different depending on how the voting goes. So I had to create the outline of the cube, create the buckets of each of the 3 cards, and still have whatever happened fit into like the overall design goals of this cube. I had to watch as people voted on things that I would not have picked. And as a cube designer, that also was very difficult to watch. Because like I said, maybe 1/3 of those were the ones that I would have picked, and then 2/3 were cards I wouldn't have picked.
And these were out of 3 every bucket, right? So it's
every
kind
bucket.
Of just like a random number generator.
330 cards that were narrowed down to 110 cards. Pretty evenly split across all of the colors, and then artifacts, gold cards, a couple of gold cards, and then a couple of lands. Yeah, but to like to watch that process, and knowing, I honestly, I put more like work, like myself and isolation into that project than I have like any other cube from the time I started it to the time I finished it ever. Just because I had to try to blunt the potential wrongness of people voting. I don't know any other way to phrase it.
I'm going to challenge you on this a little bit, Justin, just because we share the goal of getting as many people into Cube as possible. And I personally think that one of the best ways into Cube is to make your own cube. I think not everyone has access to a play group where they can play with someone else's cube or whatever. And so for me, it's like, just get some cards, put them in sleeves, and start playing, start drafting, because it's going to be fun, and then go from there. So you mentioned that like the cube would be a train wreck, right? It would be non-functional if you just let the internet vote on it entirely.
Well, this was my fear.
In one sense, I totally agree. In that, I think I listened, a while ago. I think you were on Sully Singleton talking about this, and I remember you saying that the people that are voting for all sorts of different reasons that are not like cube health reasons, right? They're voting on the card they like the most, they recognize from Constructed, the card that they're doing a Chaos Muppet thing and they just want to throw a wrench into the system, right? So like I agree that the broad democracy of just letting people vote for all the cards in a cube is not going to produce a particularly coherent end result. But I do also think that one of the great things about draft is that it's self-correcting. If there's bad cards, people presumably won't take them. They'll go late in the packs. And it's also inherently a level playing field, right? So even if the cube is kind of a train wreck by like what you would consider like design standards, you're still going to put 8 players down at the table, and it still requires the same skill and the same understanding of the game to draft a functional deck from that cube. And I don't know, I think it's a very different goal than what you ended up doing. What you ended up doing was really interesting. This kind of controlled chaos situation where you built this sandbox where, you know, you wouldn't let the kids drown themselves, but they could still throw sand in their eyes. You know, that I think was a very interesting experiment. But I would also be curious to see what people would do, and more importantly, take that huge chaos cube that's designed by the internet at large. What does it look like drafted? You know, what does it feel like to play that environment? And, you know, what is people's feedback on it? Is it just that these cards make no sense and it's totally insane, or are there these emergent themes that end up popping up? I'm not sure what would happen.
So I've had a chance to play the cube more since actually I talked about it on Solo Singleton, because that was like in the middle of, I think it was around the time of SCGCon, maybe a little bit before. Ultimately, I was way too concerned, and the cube actually is very fun. As it turned out, like in the
form, Magic is just fun. Drafting is fun.
Magic's just great.
Magic is
still
fun.
Cube. Like you said, it's still Cube, and the cube is actually really great. Ultimately, I'm really happy with how it turned out. It was a significant amount of work and a lot of watching and waiting to see how things turned out, and it probably didn't take a whole year off my life, but maybe a little bit.
You won't know till you die, then you can look back and figure it out.
Exactly, and I'll be like, yeah, 6 months for that goddamn player's cube. There it is.
You never know until the end.
But ultimately, it turned out really fun, even though it was a difficult and stressful process.
Well, Justin, it's been a pleasure having you on. I think our listeners have gotten a good sense of where you come from, what your perspective on Cube is. And I know I'm grateful to hear about some of the relatively early days of Cube as someone who only came to this format like 5-ish years ago. It's really interesting to hear about, you know, what it was like back before we had the whole plethora of content we have now. So I want to direct everybody to go check out your podcast, The 540 with Ryan Overturf, also a weekly Cube podcast. We welcome all Cube podcasts with open arms and are glad to see more content out there for everybody that loves this format as much as we do. What else do you want to point people towards, Justin?
Well, in addition to The 540, I have what I call my primary podcast, which is Think Twice. We are almost 190 episodes in. We were going for several years. It's myself.
That's an accomplishment.
It really is. It really is. Yeah, it's a long time. Myself and my co-host, Ali Antrazi and Stephen Green. And you can search Think Twice MTG on any audio platform. We are a magic and pop culture podcast. So half of the podcast is magic, half of the podcast is pop culture, movies, music, TV shows, books, other board games, other games, stuff like that. Whatever strikes our fancy. So definitely check that out. If you like listening to me on this, you'll probably like listening to me on that too. In addition to that, most people know me from Commander Versus. You can find Commander Versus on YouTube and Star City Games. And I also stream twice a week, Saturdays at 10 p.m. and Mondays at 8 p.m. both Eastern Time on twitch.tv/jparnell. And that's all of the content that I make. It's a lot.
I've been thinking this whole episode about how, you know, if we're calling everybody that makes podcasts and articles content creator now, is like, you know, can we just call, like, is Ernest Hemingway a content creator? Is Shakespeare a content creator?
Exactly.
It's just old school content creation is all it is.
Yeah. That's what they've been doing the whole time.
That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the magic cards are made by Wizards of the Coast. All of the listening is done by you, and all the talking is done by me, Andy Mangold, and my co-host, Anthony Maddox, and this time, Justin. Thank you both for talking about Magic with us.
Thank you guys. I mean, honestly, it was, I love coming on and chatting with you both. I appreciate you reaching out to me and making this happen.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to have you. Love to talk about Magic with more great minds.